I'm Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of this second series of video programs on postgraduate research and supervision. This video series has been produced simply from recordings of a residential staff development program on postgraduate research and supervision held at the Pan Pacific Hotel on the Queensland Gold Coast in September 1993. The aim of this series is to provide supervisors and postgraduate students with resources to understand and improve their postgraduate studies in their department or institution.
The first thing that I want to talk about is the importance of research mapping. Now, different people call this different things. Some people call it research design, with a different meaning from what Jen was talking about as research design or research proposal in the last session. Some people call it concept charting. Robert, I think, calls it mind mapping. What it is basically is a process that you go through at the beginning of the thesis and therefore also at the beginning of the writing process, which should start right from the beginning of the candidature, of brainstorming, of getting your ideas down on paper, no matter how loose or how seemingly unrelated at the time. The student should be encouraged to sit down with as big a piece of paper as possible, write in the centre of it the keywords of the topic, and then brainstorm. Write down everything that he or she can think of relating to that topic, whether it may be relevant in the end or not. This is an example of a brainstorm. It looks like one too, doesn't it? From a student that I was supervising earlier this year who was doing a research project on the multifunction polis in Adelaide from the point of view of the Japanese side of the equation. She wrote her topic in the middle, MFP, and then she wrote down everything that she could think of that might be relevant to her study. Now, once you've done this initial brainstorming, which the student should do on his or her own and then bring along to the supervisor to have a look at, the next step is to organise those ideas into what are relevant and what are irrelevant. And then you arrive with something like the next OHP, which was the same student's idea flowchart. And that's what I'm talking about when I say research design, an idea flowchart. Organising the ideas which come out from your brainstorming session into some sort of consistently flowing flowchart, which then becomes the basis of your writing process, because you decide where your first section will begin. None of this is set in stone, it's all open to change later. What your second main section will be, third, etc., fourth, and then as you begin your reading, if you're the student, you organise the data that you come across into those relevant sections, whether it's on a computer file or in a loose leaf folder like this with a different section for each of your major headings on your idea flowchart. What are the advantages of doing this in the first place, and why is it important to the writing process? First of all, because doing this sorts out your thinking. It helps you to develop some sort of systematic approach to the thesis topic from chaos. Now, that first mind mapping or brainstorming OHP resembled chaos fairly nearly, didn't it? When you had all your ideas down, stemming out in no particular order. When you get to the stage, though, of putting it into the chart, the flow chart, the concept chart, whatever you want to call it, it helps you develop a systematic approach to your next step of collecting data and beginning to write it up. It helps you to segment the topic into manageable steps. Once you've got your flowchart, you can say, yes, okay, I'll start by looking at section 1 or section 4 or whatever happens to suit your particular circumstances. And that helps students to overcome this fear, which is particularly prevalent at the beginning of a candidature, whether it's honours or master's research or PhD, or an established experienced researcher, for that matter, writing a new book, of this monolithic task of getting this whole project underway and producing a thesis or a book at the end of it. It segments it into manageable steps. It also helps you to identify limitations in terms of time, the size of the project, and if it's relevant, the amount of money that you might need to complete it, if you're going to need outside funding or departmental funding for some of the steps. It helps you to identify priorities and to eliminate what's irrelevant. Not all the ideas that you come up with in your brainstorming session are going to be relevant to your final thesis. It helps you to sort them into segments and identify what's central and what's peripheral, and saves you from wasting a lot of time going down blind alleys that look promising at the beginning, but in fact turn out to be a waste of time. More importantly, with relation to the writing process, this kind of flowchart lays the basis for the structure of the finished project. So once you've got a good design worked out on paper, that then very often becomes the structure of the thesis in terms of chapters and sections. And the thesis then virtually writes itself in terms of logical development of the argument. Once you have collected your ideas into logical sections, collected the data that fits in those sections, you then look through it and consolidate, analyse, synthesise, but your basic structure is already there, which is a tremendous help when you're starting to write a large paper. Time management, of course, is extremely important in supervising thesis writing. Why is it important? For these three reasons, and you may have others too that will come out later in the discussion, because if you don't manage your time well as a student, you will not finish within the minimum time. That's particularly a problem in arts faculties around the country. In our university, no funds come to the department after 5 years full-time for a full-time PhD student. So it's in the department's interest, as well as the student's own interest, to ensure that the thesis is completed in the minimum time. If you don't finish in the minimum time as a student, then you may run out of financial support if you're on some sort of scholarship. And you also won't usually achieve your aim of graduating and finding a job unless you've got those basic criteria of having your PhD and ideally having some publications as well. So it's extremely important for the supervisor and the student to work together in the writing process on time management. Other people have mentioned this also in their sections, and I'd just like to emphasise that even more strongly. Most departments will have a departmental document which is aimed at helping with time management, which sets out what's required of the PhD student at the end of the first year of their candidature, if it's a full-time student, or the second year if it's a part-time student. And I thought I'd just show you what our department, Japanese and Chinese Studies, has. Basically what it says is that by the end of the first year of full-time candidature, the student has to prepare a substantial research paper of around 6,000 to 10,000 words, outlining the objectives of the thesis, the state of the art in the chosen field, and why the proposed project would represent an original contribution, the outcome of the literature search and a preliminary bibliography, a detailed outline of the methodology, and a statement of hypotheses, if relevant, the tentative outline of the argument, including the chapter structure, and a schedule of research and writing activities that will lead to completion within the minimum time. And that should include any problems that people see. For example, one of our students wrote in hers that she had just become pregnant and would be taking 6 months maternity leave later on in her candidature and would therefore need to extend. Many of our students go overseas also during their candidature to do fieldwork on their research topic. This has to be submitted to the supervisor and the head of department at least 2 months before the end of the first year. It's very important to the writing process to clarify with the student right at the beginning what the objectives are, what the objectives of the research proposal are. After 6 months, they should be able to encapsulate their main statement or hypothesis in one long sentence, or at least articulate it in a couple of lines. If you need a half a page after 6 months, it's too long. You're not focused enough. Once you've got that clarified to the satisfaction of yourself and your supervisor, then you can start to work out a timetable of activities that you can work to manage your time successfully. What order do you need to do things in? You might need a certain amount of time for the literature search, or a certain amount of time for drawing up your research design by the end of that first year, or 10 months rather. Can some of the steps be done simultaneously, or do they all have to be done in sequence? What what do you need to have done at each stage if it's a sequence model before you can proceed to the next? Do you need to go overseas for a period, and if so, when would be the best time in the candidature? And if that's the case, when do you need to start applying for scholarships, in our case from the Japan Foundation and the Japanese Education Ministry, to get you there for that period in Japan that you want as part of your candidature? All these things need to be thought about in relation to time management once you have your objectives clarified. This is one suggested model for time allocation. It comes from thesis and assignment writing. They suggest that the students spend 60% of their time defining and limiting the problem, consulting source material, and collecting information. Then they spend another 20% of their time writing the first draft of the thesis, and another 20% revising, footnoting, referencing, writing the final draft, and proofreading. I would query that first draft figure of 20%, particularly if it's intended to be in sequence, because I think that writing should start, as I've already said, right from the beginning. There are various ways that the supervisor can encourage this. The obvious first thing is the research proposal, which is what the student brings into the department when we first set eyes on them, if they're a new student coming in, or an old student coming through onto a PhD. That is the first indication, usually, on paper of their topic. Then the literature review and other activities, so that they have an ongoing process of writing. Now they might say, oh yes, but I've got nothing to write up yet. There is always something that can be found for them to write up. It might even be just writing up what their thought processes were in arriving at their topic. How did they first become interested in this? Not the formal kind of rationale that you give in the actual research design, but more an analysis of the thought processes, just to get their hands in to start writing. It's not going to appear in the thesis in its finished form, but it gets them used to submitting written work and to actually putting pen to paper. So that if you start a student right from the beginning in writing up little exercises like that, just a couple of pages or so at a time, it takes away the fear of writing the horrible first draft, which so many people seem to be so worried about. And it helps them to focus and sharpen their writing skills right from the beginning. Here are some of the ways that the supervisor can help with the writing process. They can insist from the beginning that the student does what I've already referred to, and that's encapsulate their central question in a very short and pithy statement, and then make sure that wherever their main study is done, whether it's at home or in a departmental office, that that statement is pinned up exactly at eye level in front of them, so that whenever they look up from their books, that's right there in bold print about that high in front of them. And that prevents them from straying too far from the topic. It's something I need to do all the time too with research projects that I'm working on, stay with the topic. Another thing is to ask for regular submission of written work right from the beginning and return it with very substantial comment where it's required, particularly on the development of the argument. Here's the initial activity that I referred to before of having the student write a think aloud account of how they arrived at their topic. And it's very important to insist on the regular submission of written work for students who are spending part of their candidature overseas and who will be out of range of their supervisor for 6 to 9 months. Where there's a problem which exists with good writing skills, such as spelling, grammar, it's not, I think, the supervisor's duty to take remedial action here, but the supervisor should point the student in the direction of counselling services, which at our university, and I would think at most universities, offer courses to help with correcting this. And you might also find useful computer software such as Grammatica, or at the very least the spell check function in the word processing program. Because it's very important, as we'll see in a moment, that the student learn to proofread for errors, for spelling errors, and for typos. Something that a group of supervisors might do is run writing workshops within the department for postgrads, interactive sessions for them to participate in, to make them aware of particular specific skills And ones that our particular postgrads have asked for in this regard are things like how to write an abstract, what's the best way to write a pithy introduction, how do you write a literature review. Maybe you can get together with other departments in your same building or in your same area in your university and arrange that it's a joint activity so that more students can be reached with this kind of thing rather than just your own small group. You ought to make sure that the students are aware of any particular requirements of the university about referencing and general presentation. That's found in the university handbook under the rules for presentation of a PhD. You help the student keep on track with his or her time management. And if possible, you encourage publication during candidature. Now that's a whole new other section, which there will be more on much later. But that's also another way that the supervisor can help to encourage it, the writing process. Just coming back to the importance of proofreading, in our rules on presentation of theses in the University of Queensland handbook, it's stressed that it's up to the student to make sure that the thesis is presented in a format free of typographical errors and other boo-boos. This can actually, if they are present, this can actually result in the delay of the awarding of the degree. And I just brought along a sample of an examiner's report that came in last year, which recommended that although the content of the degree was excellent and the research methodology likewise, nevertheless, what prevents me from recommending immediate acceptance is that the presentation is so heavily marred by typos as to make the reader question whether it has even been proofread. That particular thesis was delayed, the award of the degree was delayed for around 4 to 5 months until all those typos were fixed up. Sources of feedback for the student on writing are, of course, the supervisor, first and foremost. Other staff members are usually willing to read and comment on a chapter if you give them enough time to do it. If the student arrives at my door and says, I'm so-and-so's student, but would you mind reading my document, my chapter 2, and saying whether you think it flows well? I'm happy to do that, provided that I'm given a week or so to do it, and not by this afternoon, please. And I think most staff members would too. Other sources are fellow students. Now these are good because in the humanities they're often removed from your own particular area, even within the same department. In a science department you may have graduate students working in a team on a similar problem, but in the humanities and the social sciences that's less likely to happen. In fact, it's totally unlikely in my experience to happen. So that people are going, if you ask a fellow student to read your work as a student, then they're going to look at it from a different perspective of your own particular discipline or your own particular area within that discipline. And they can tell you whether or not your argument runs logically to them, or whether or not they understood what you were talking about by the time they finished reading it. And the other source of invaluable feedback, if the student is publishing, are the journal editors of the journals to which they submit their work, and the referees' reports which come back. Very often in Japanese studies, some of the American journals will send back extremely detailed referee reports, whether they accept or reject the article. And they can be very, very valuable sources of feedback from referees who are usually top experts in their field. So since the student is going to be aiming at publishing anyway, that kind of experience, even if it's a rejection, which is hard to take, can let them see whether or not their work measures up to the standards of what's publishable in their own particular area. And since one of the things that examiners are asked to comment on is whether or not the thesis is of publishable standard, that gives them an idea, other than the ideas provided by their supervisor, as to how they're going. Lastly, for me, what do examiners look for? These are the departmental guidelines for examining honours theses: rationale, execution, research design, methodology, range of source materials and ability to synthesise and analyse them, presentation of argument and data, and the format type question, organisation and presentation of thesis, including the notes and the bibliography. The University of Queensland PhD examiner's criteria are these ones. The candidate's thesis should provide a contribution to knowledge with a level of originality consistent with 3 to 4 years full-time study and supervised research training after a bachelor's degree with honours. That's the first one. It should reveal a capacity to relate the research topic to the broader framework of knowledge in the disciplinary area in which it falls. It should be clearly, accurately and cogently written and suitably documented. Those are the 3 main criteria. In addition, examiners are asked to comment on whether they consider the thesis to be of publishable standard or not. If you, as a supervisor, give to the student right at the beginning of the candidature this page, copied from the university handbook, they will know what it is that they are aiming for in their writing. They will know the standards that they have to meet in presenting their finished document, and because they know those standards, they will have that much more confidence. It's amazing how many students haven't been told or haven't looked up for themselves what the examiner's criteria are in looking at a thesis. Once they know it, whether or not they think, oh, can I do that or not, it nevertheless gives them a bit of confidence in their writing because they know what they're aiming for, rather than aiming out into the void and hoping they hit the mark.